Number 3. Ross Carlson. August 18, 1983 was shaping up to be a hot day in Littleton, Colorado. A construction worker who was driving to work saw two people lying in a field on the outskirts of Littleton. He stopped his car and went to check on the people. At first, it looked like they had just fallen asleep face down in the field. It was a man and a woman, and they were both fully dressed in nice clothing. As the construction worker got closer to them, it became apparent that they were dead, so he went and called the police. The bodies were identified as Rod and Marilyn Carlson, who were both 37 years old. They were both teachers. Rod taught the 6th grade, and Marilyn taught kindergarten. They both had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. Rod was probably killed first, and then Marilyn was shot. The police went to the couple's home, and they found their only son, 19-year-old Ross, eating breakfast. The detectives informed him that his parents had been killed, and he looked shocked. By the end of the day, Ross was arrested. A year earlier, Ross had been arrested for applying to blow up his family's house so that his family could claim the insurance money. Ross claimed that he had been trying to help his parents get out of debt. He wasn't given any jail time, but he did have to see a court-appointed psychiatrist. The police thought that Marilyn and Rod were killed the night before their bodies were found. The police questioned Ross, and he said he had an alibi for that night. He had gone out for dinner and a movie with friends. He showed them a receipt for the restaurant and a movie stub. But then the police questioned the friends he was supposedly with that night. Ross's friends said that he did buy a ticket for the movie, but he didn't stay in the theater. They said he left just as the movie was starting. They found him after the movie in the parking lot waiting by his car. They also said that he told them that if anyone asked where he was that evening, they were to say that he was with them. Ross's friends said he was spoiled, entitled, and self-centered. They said Ross was always buying new things, like stereo equipment and clothes, and he always had to have the best stuff. His parents were planning on remortgaging their house to pay for his college tuition. A few days after the murders, the police found the gun that was used to kill Rod and Marilyn. It was hidden at the home of one of Ross's friends. The police then discovered that Rod and Marilyn had a large life insurance policy which would pay out to Ross if they died. The police concluded that Ross killed his parents for their life insurance money. While Ross was in custody, a psychiatrist interviewed him. Ross told the psychiatrist that he should ask Justin about the murders. Ross explained that he had multiple personalities, and Justin was one of them. After a few months in the county jail, Ross was transferred to the Colorado State Hospital. At the hospital, Ross was interviewed by several doctors, and he underwent hypnosis. These interviews and hypnosis sessions were all videotaped. During this time, the doctors talked to 6 supposed personalities. One of them was Justin, who was in control most of the time. He was a social and outgoing 16-year-old. Another personality was Steve, who was 42 years old, and he took over so that work like chores and homework could get done. A third personality was Norman. He smoked, he had a foul mouth, and he spoke with a slight Brooklyn accent. Justin said he didn't like Norman because Norman had a big mouth, which would get them into trouble. Another personality was named Glib, and he was suave and articulate. Blue was a personality that was 10 years old. He cried often, and he sucked his thumb. Finally, there was Black. Black was an angry personality who worked as the protector. One time, while Ross was under hypnosis, he talked about the murders. He said he remembered standing behind someone who was wearing a black hood, and he watched the murders over their shoulder. He said he didn't know which personality he was standing behind, but it wasn't blue or black. He said he knew it wasn't Black because Black would have killed them with his bare hands. Friends and neighbors of Ross were interviewed, and several of them remembered strange encounters that they had with Ross. For example, one day when Ross was 14, he mowed a neighbor's lawn. The neighbor said that 2 hours later, Ross did not remember cutting the lawn. One of Ross's ex-girlfriends said that he used to talk about a twin brother named Justin. A classmate said that she bumped into Ross one day downtown. At first, they didn't recognize each other. The classmate said she didn't recognize Ross because he was acting like a 40-year-old man. The courts believe that Ross did have multiple personality disorder. In 1984, and then again in 1987, a judge ruled that he could not face trial until the personalities had merged. While he waited to go to trial, Ross had to stay in the Colorado State Hospital. In the hospital, he supposedly developed a new personality named Holden. Holden was one-dimensional, and he didn't remember anything before the hospital. Since he apparently had no memory of life before the hospital, he carried a file folder with him to help him navigate conversations. Ross's lawyer said that Holden emerged just to deal with life in the hospital. Many people on the hospital staff did not think that Ross had multiple personalities. They thought he was just faking it to avoid trial. They also thought that he was an arrogant brat. Ross was highly critical of the hospital staff. They said he didn't even think they gave him a chance, and they had already made up their mind about him before he even got to the hospital. However, at least one doctor believed him, and he worked to fuse the personalities together. At his peak, Ross supposedly had 10 personalities living inside of him. By 1989, 7 years after the murders, Ross really wanted to go to trial and get it over with. He was tired of living in the hospital. He thought he should be able to leave the hospital because he wasn't insane, he just had a disorder that could be treated. Then in November 1989, a judge ruled that Ross was competent to stand trial. But the day after the ruling, Ross was diagnosed with leukemia. On November 23, 1989, 3 weeks after he was diagnosed, Ross, who was 25 years old, died from his illness in the hospital. Number 2. Johnny Frank Garrett. On the morning of November 1st, 1981, the nuns of the St. Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas, noticed that one of their sisters was missing from the morning mass. They went to 76-year-old Sister Tadea Ben's bedroom, and they found her nude, dead body in her bed. There was blood on her face, and her body had several bruises, but the nuns thought that she had died naturally, so they took her body to prepare it for burial. But then later that day, they noticed a broken window and a cut window screen at the back of the convent, so they called the police. After a short examination of the body and a search of the convent, the police knew that Benz had been brutally murdered. The police determined that someone had climbed through the broken window and made their way to Sister Benz's room. Benz had been sexually assaulted, beaten in the head, and stabbed. The cause of death was manual strangulation. The police found a bent butter knife under her bed. There was no blood on the knife, and it wasn't the knife used to stab Benz. The police dusted the knife for prints, and they found one fingerprint. They also found some fingerprints on Benz's headboard. The fingerprints were all from one person. The people of Amarillo were shocked by the murder, and they demanded justice. Less than a week after the murder, the police arrested 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett. Garrett came to the attention of the police thanks to a tip from a psychic named Inez Patterson. Patterson told the police that she had a dream about the murder, and her dream revealed to her who the killer was. She said that the killer was a young man with big ears and a face like Abraham Lincoln. She also said that the name Mr. Clyde was associated with the killer somehow. Patterson said the killer's home address even came to her in the dream. The address just happened to be Garrett's address. He and his family lived across the road from the convent. The family had a dog who lived in the backyard, and his name was Mr. Clyde. The dog's name was written in big letters on the doghouse. Garrett also looked like the description of the killer that Patterson gave to the police. The police didn't seem to care that all of Patterson's predictions had a logical explanation, and they probably didn't come from a dream. Patterson was probably walking by the convent, and she saw Garrett outside of his home. She noted his appearance, the address, and the writing on the doghouse. One reason the police probably didn't care about how they found Garrett is because he was an ideal suspect. Garrett was a troubled teenager. When he was born, his brain was deprived of oxygen, and this left him with brain damage. As he grew up, he was physically and sexually abused by several stepfathers. When Garrett was 10, he started drinking alcohol and doing drugs. He eventually started huffing paint thinner, which further damaged his brain. His IQ level was below 70. A few weeks before the murder, he had been released from a school for delinquents. On the day of the murder, he was seen near the convent. The police compared Garrett's fingerprints to the fingerprints that were found on the headboard and the butter knife. They were a match. The police questioned Garrett, and they said he confessed. However, Garrett refused to sign the confession. Nevertheless, he was charged with the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. 11 months later, Garrett went to trial to face the charges. The evidence against him was the unsigned confession and the fact that his fingerprints were found on the headboard and on the butter knife that was found under Benz's bed. Garrett swore that he didn't kill Benz. He said that he had been in the convent several times. He said that he liked looking at the paintings and he had helped the nuns move furniture. He said his fingerprints could have been all over the convent. Garrett's lawyer said that he was being targeted because the police wanted swift justice in the case. The police could only prove that Garrett was in Benz's room, but they couldn't prove that he killed her. Notably, the butter knife that was found under the bed with his fingerprint on it was not the murder weapon. Garrett's biggest problem at his trial was his lawyer. There was plenty of evidence that pointed at a different suspect, but his lawyer didn't present any of this at the trial. This included short, curly, black afro-type hair that didn't belong to Garrett or Benz. Also, a man with a dark complexion was seen on the grounds of the convent at around midnight on the night of the murder. He was hiding behind a tree until he was spotted, and then he ran away. Because of the hairs in the eyewitnesses' accounts, in the early days of the investigation, the police were questioning Cuban men as possible suspects. Something else that his lawyer failed to bring up in court was that there was a very similar murder that happened on July 8, 1981, 4 months before Benz was killed. Narnie Box Bryson was 77, and she was killed in her bed. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death with a telephone cord. After Benz was murdered, the police thought that the two cases were connected. Besides the victims being very similar, the crime scenes had a lot of commonalities. The killer had entered both victims' homes through a cut window screen. At both crime scenes, the killer left behind a white t-shirt. Finally, short curly black hairs were found at both crime scenes. But after Garrett was linked to the murder of Sister Tadea Benz, the police decided that the two murders were not connected. Something else that could have helped clear Garrett's name was the unsigned confession. It contained several errors. For example, it said that Garrett left through the window that he climbed in through, but there were signs that the killer left through a fire exit. Unfortunately for Garrett, his lawyer did not bring up any of this in his trial. The jury ultimately found Garrett guilty. Even though Garrett had an IQ level below 70 and he was 17 at the time of the murder, he was sentenced to death. The Catholic Church was upset by the sentence. They did not want Garrett to be executed. Garrett was scheduled to die on January 6, 1992, about 10 years after he was convicted. Shortly before his planned execution date, Pope John Paul II urged Governor Ann W. Richards to commute his sentence to life in prison. An hour before Garrett was scheduled to die, Governor Richards decided to postpone the execution for a month. In 1986, while he was sitting on death row, Garrett had been interviewed by a team of psychiatrists. They diagnosed him with schizophrenia. He talked to himself and he spoke to people who weren't there. Many times he thought he was talking to dead relatives. He also believed things like he was on Earth to save Native Americans from extinction. While he was on death row, people noticed that he wouldn't just have conversations with people who weren't there, he also became different people. Then in 1991, the same team of psychiatrists who diagnosed Garrett with schizophrenia 5 years earlier saw an episode of 48 Hours that covered Garrett's story. After seeing the episode, they realized that Garrett didn't have schizophrenia. Instead, they thought he had dissociative identity disorder. Shortly before Garrett was supposed to be executed, the team got in touch with his lawyer and they asked to assess him. His lawyer agreed to the assessment and he set up a meeting for them with Garrett. After talking to him, they concluded that they were correct. Garrett had multiple personalities. They asked him about the murder of Tadea Benz. Garrett said that another one of his personalities, named Aaron Shockman, took over, and he was the one who killed the nun. During the month that the execution was postponed, Garrett's lawyer tried to get him clemency, saying that Garrett wasn't responsible for the murder. Instead, Aaron Shockman was responsible. The clemency board discussed the matter for 45 minutes. They ultimately denied clemency. One final appeal was filed to save Garrett's life. The appeal argued that since Garrett had an IQ below 70 and he was 17 years old when the crime was committed, he shouldn't be executed. But he lost that appeal as well. In the days leading up to his execution, Garrett wrote a letter cursing everyone who was involved in the case. This included the police, the lawyers, the judges, and members of the media. He also cursed all their families. He wrote that when their family members die, it's his soul they'll meet, and they'll pay for what they did to his family. He closed off the letter by writing, "And because I know that the curses will be fulfilled, I meet death in a better spirit and stronger soul." On February 11, 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was brought into the execution chamber in the Huntsville prison. According to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Garrett didn't have any official last words. But his family, who was present at the execution, and several news outlets say that this is incorrect. They said that during his last statement, he proclaimed his innocence. He then told his family that he loved them, but he said the rest of the world could kiss his ass. Garrett was then executed via lethal injection. Some people believe that Garrett's curse is real because several people who were involved in his case were struck with tragedy after he was executed. For example, one juror died after falling down the stairs, and a reporter who had harassed Garrett's mother was killed in a plane crash. Also, a judge, one of Garrett's appellate attorneys, and 2 police officers who worked on the case were diagnosed with leukemia. Only his appellate attorney survived the illness. Then in 2004, there was a new wrinkle in the case. While the police in Amarillo considered Sister Tadea Benn's case closed, they had yet to solve the murder of 77-year-old Narnie Box Bryson. She was murdered in her Amarillo home about 4 months before Ben's was killed. She was murdered in a similar fashion to Ben's. Someone broke into her home through a window, then sexually assaulted and strangled her to death. Short black curly hair and a white t-shirt were found at both crime scenes. At first, the police thought that the 2 cases were connected. But then Johnny Frank Garrett was arrested for the murder of Ben's, and that theory was dismissed. In 2005, DNA that was found in Bryson's bedroom was inputted into CODIS. A match to the DNA was found. It was the DNA of 55-year-old Inicio Perez Ruda, a Cuban refugee who was living in Amarillo at the time of the murders. Ruda had given a sample of his DNA to take part in a drug rehab program. Ruda pleaded guilty to killing Narnie Box Bryson, and he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. An attorney from Albany, New York, named Jesse Quackenbush did a documentary on Johnny Frank Garrett. It is called The Last Word, and it was released in 2008. For the documentary, Quackenbush interviewed Ruda. He asked Ruda about the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. Ruda said he didn't kill her. Instead, he blamed the murder on his friend, Fernando Flores. Before Garrett was arrested, Flores had been a suspect in Sister Tadea Benz's murder. It's important to point out that Ruda blamed Flores for killing Narnie Box Bryson, but only his DNA was found at the crime scene, and he pleaded guilty to killing her. Flores was never charged in connection with Bryson's murder. After Ruda was arrested, Garrett's mother asked for the DNA from Benz's murder to be tested. She said she would give the city and the county civil immunity for the wrongful execution of her son. The only thing she wanted was her son's DNA to be compared to the DNA that was left in Benz's bedroom. The city of Amarillo and Randall County responded to her request days later. They flat out refused to do the testing. They went on to say that if she did file a wrongful death lawsuit, they would sue her for damages and legal fees. They considered Johnny Frank Garrett the killer of Sister Tadea Benz, and the case is officially closed. Number 1. Thomas Huskey. In the fall of 1992, Knoxville, Tennessee suffered a rash of disappearances. It started with the disappearance of 30-year-old Susan Stone. Stone had married a drug dealer in 1985, and she became addicted to cocaine. She often made money to support her habit through sex work. In early 1992, she seemed to be getting her life together. She had a job as a clerk at a dating processing center. But in September 1992, she was back out working the streets of Knoxville. She vanished in the last week of September. Just over 2 weeks later, on October 13th, 32-year-old sex worker Patricia Anderson went missing. The next day, 22-year-old Darlene Smith vanished. Smith was not a sex worker, but she lived in an area where prostitutes were known to frequent. On October 20th, 6 days after Smith went missing, 31-year-old Patricia Johnson disappeared. Like Patricia Anderson and Susan Stone, Johnson was a sex worker. The day after Johnson went missing, a hunter in some woods on the outskirts of Knoxville came across the dead body of a woman, so he called the police. The police were able to identify the body. It was Patricia Anderson. The police immediately had a suspect, a 32-year-old man named Thomas Huskey. 9 months earlier, a woman came into a police station in Knoxville and said she had been attacked by a man. The woman was a sex worker, but she didn't tell the police that. She thought if they knew she was a sex worker, they wouldn't believe her story. The woman told the detective that she had been taken out to the woods, tied up, sexually assaulted, and robbed. The officer drove the woman to the woods where the assault happened. It was the same woods where Anderson's body was found. When they got to the woods, the woman was shocked to see that her attacker's car was parked on the outskirts of the woods. The officer and the woman walked a short distance into the woods, and they found Thomas Huskey with the naked woman. She identified him as her attacker. The woman he was with was a sex worker. Thomas was arrested, and he was charged with a variety of crimes. However, both women refused to testify against Thomas, so he was released. In the year leading up to his arrest, Huskey had become well known to the sex workers in Knoxville. He had developed a bad reputation because he liked to tie up women, and he was known to get rough with them. The sex workers even had a nickname for him. They called him the Zoo Man. They called him this because he liked to take sex workers to an abandoned barn near the Knoxville Zoo. Both Thomas and his father had worked at the zoo. His father was an elephant trainer, and Thomas did odd jobs around the zoo. But Thomas was fired after 2 years on the job because he had been abusing the animals. The day after Patricia Anderson's body was found, Thomas Huskey was brought to court to enter a plea for charges of solicitation. At the courthouse, he had to sign a waiver. Instead of signing Thomas Huskey, he signed the waiver with the name Kyle Huskey. The police continued to search the woods where Anderson's body was found. Over the next week, they found the bodies of the other 3 missing women. They had all been tied up and strangled to death. Thomas lived with his parents in their mobile home. In Thomas's bedroom, the police found some of the dead women's belongings and some rope that was similar to the rope that was used to tie up the women. While Thomas was in police custody, another personality supposedly took control. This personality said his name was Kyle. Kyle said that he hated the goody-goody Thomas and he wanted to ruin his life. Kyle said that's why he killed the women. Besides Kyle, the police and psychiatrists noted at least 4 other personalities. This included Philip Dax, who was an Englishman, and Timmy, who was a gay man. The other 2 personalities were named Jericho and Larry. Thomas said that he didn't know what his other personalities did when they were in control. He said that when they emerged, he suffered blackouts that were followed by severe headaches. Thomas Huskey did not go to trial until late 1995, and when he did go to trial, it wasn't for the murders of the 4 women. Instead, it was for 4 sexual assaults that he committed before he began his series of murders. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 66 years in prison. In early 1999, just over 7 years after Thomas was arrested, he went to trial for the murders of the 4 women. The main piece of evidence was the recording of the confession. The prosecution played the recording of the confession for the jury. On the recording, they heard Thomas use 3 different voices for 3 of his personalities. One of the supposed personalities, Kyle, confessed to the murders. The defense had psychiatrists testify. The psychiatrists testified that Thomas had dissociative identity disorder. The prosecution argued that Thomas was just faking the disorder. They said he just pulled the names of his other supposed personalities from different aspects of his life. For example, he said that one of his personalities was named Kyle. Thomas grew up on Kyle Avenue in Knoxville. The prosecution also said that he based his personalities on characters in the soap opera Days of Our Lives. The jury ended up deliberating for 5 days. On the 5th day, they sent a note to the judge saying they were deadlocked. 5 jurors thought that Thomas was sane and he was responsible for the 4 murders. 4 thought he was insane and therefore he wasn't criminally responsible. The last 3 couldn't decide if he was sane or insane. Since the jury couldn't reach a verdict, the judge declared a mistrial. The district attorney tried to bring the case to trial again in 2002, but the judge would not allow the confession to be heard in trial. During his interrogation, Thomas asked for a lawyer twice, and the detectives did not stop questioning him. The judge ruled that since he wasn't given a lawyer after he had asked for one, it made the confession inadmissible. Then, the evidence that was found in Thomas's room, like the victim's belongings, and the rope that was similar to the rope used to tie up the victims, was also barred from being admitted as evidence in court. That evidence was tossed out because there was a problem with the search warrant. In 2005, the district attorney said that they would not be retrying Thomas Huskey for the 4 murders. Many people, including the police who investigated the murders and the district attorney's office, think that Thomas was faking the multiple personalities and he got away with murder. Thomas Huskey was first eligible for parole in 2012, but his request was denied. Thomas is currently incarcerated in the South Central Correctional Facility in Clifton, Tennessee. He'll be able to apply for parole again in 2041. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching.